When the alien warrior's armor crashed into Bay 12, I thought it was just another repair job. Then she told me I was touching her too softly. What she didn't realize was that her combat gear wasn't equipment. It had become part of her nervous system. And after 15 years of battlefield fixes, it was slowly killing her. Purple lightning flickered between the solar collectors outside Bay 12, each discharge casting stark momentary shadows across David Park's workshop. He watched from the reinforced viewport, fingers tapping an idle rhythm against his thigh. Ion storms on Kepler 78b weren't rare, but this one felt personal. The atmospheric interference hissed through external mics like static from a dead channel. David had spent 3 years on this rock, and he'd learned to read the weather like a mechanic reads engine hums. This storm meant trouble. He was already mentally cataloging which systems might fail first when the emergency beacon tore through the ambient noise. It wasn't the standard distress ping. This was a full system blast, the kind that meant a ship was seconds from catastrophic failure. David didn't flinch. He'd built his reputation on not flinching. He just turned, grabbed his toolkit, and started for the bay doors. By the time the wreckage hit, he was already pulling on his insulated gloves. The transport ship didn't so much land as collapse into the emergency bay. Its hull was a mess of carbon scoring and twisted metal, one thruster still sputtering weak blue flame. The air smelled of ozone and burnt wiring. David approached with the cautious steps of someone who'd seen ships come apart at the seams. The only survivor stood amid the wreckage, and she was unlike any casualty he'd ever processed. Nearly 7 feet tall, encased in armor that seemed both ancient and alarmingly advanced. Its surface was a mosaic of repair patches and deep scars, and where it wasn't scarred, it sparked. She held herself rigid, one hand braced against a fallen support beam. Her helmet was off, revealing sharp features and eyes that didn't so much look at him as assess him. David noted the way her armor's neck seals were strained, the faint tremor in her left gauntlet. He'd seen powered armor fail before. It was never pretty. Bay 12 is the only repair facility on this side of the colony, he said, his voice calm over the fading alarm. You're leaking coolant from your secondary systems. Your neural interface is probably flickering. You need help. Her response was a low, resonant tone that didn't ask for anything. Valoran warriors do not require assistance. David didn't argue. He'd met her type before, not aliens but soldiers who thought accepting help was a flaw in their code. He set his toolkit down with a deliberate thud. I'm not offering to carry you. I'm offering a diagnostic. Your systems are failing. You can stand here until they fail completely, or you can let me confirm what you already know. She watched him for a long moment, her gaze shifting from his face to the tools, then to the wreckage around them. Something in her posture eased just slightly. Not surrender. Reevaluation. You may examine the armor, she said finally. Do not touch the spinal interface. David gave a short nod. Deal, I'm David, by the way. Kiriel, he moved forward, his steps measured. Up close, the damage was even more evident. The armor wasn't just banged up, it was exhausted. He could see where makeshift welds had been laid over older, failing ones. The power cells were reading at 20%, but the drain pattern suggested severe internal leakage. This wasn't a quick fix. This was an autopsy in progress. He opened his scanner, the blue light washing over her chest plate. This might feel strange. Try not to move. She didn't answer, but her breathing evened out. The real work was beginning, and neither of them knew how deep it would go. David's diagnostic scanner painted a ghost image of Kiriel's armor across his display, and the readings made no sense. Power fluctuations spiked and dipped in patterns that looked less like mechanical failure and more like a heartbeat under stress. The neural interface wasn't just damaged, it was responding. When he ran a baseline diagnostic, the armor's systems didn't report errors so much as they resisted, like a body pulling away from a needle. He adjusted the scanner's sensitivity, thinking it might be interference from the storm still crackling outside. But the patterns held. The armor wasn't just receiving Kiriel's neural signals, it was generating its own. Low-level cognitive feedback loops, micro-adjustments in the plating, energy distribution that mapped almost exactly to human nervous system responses. David had seen smart armor before. This wasn't smart. This was aware. He looked up from the screen, his usual professional calm fraying at the edges. Your armor. It's compensating for you. Actively. The left leg servo is overloading because it's trying to correct for that old injury in your hip. How is that possible? Kiriel didn't move, but her eyes tracked his. Valoran battle gear is not worn. It is bonded. The term hung in the air between them. Bonded. Not installed. Not interfaced. David's mind raced through the implications. This was bioneural tech, not just biomechanical. The armor learned its wearer's patterns, adapted to injuries, anticipated movements. It didn't just protect her. It collaborated with her, a second nervous system woven into carbon fiber and polyalloy. He thought of the way she'd moved when she stepped from the wreckage. Not like a person in a suit, but like a single, integrated being. The subtle shift of weight, the way the helmet had retracted not at a command, but at a thought. He ran a deeper scan, this time focusing on the feedback between her biometrics and the armor's internal systems. The data stream was a conversation. Her elevated heart rate triggered a cooling response in the chest plate. A minute tremor in her hand was being countered by stabilizers in the wrist joint. The armor wasn't just reacting. It was caring for her. This is cognitive technology, he said, mostly to himself. It's not hardware. It's a partner. Kiriel gave a single slow nod. It learns the wearer. The longer the bond, the deeper the integration. It becomes an extension. That reframed everything. This wasn't a repair job. It was a negotiation. You don't fix a partner. You work with them. David's approach would have to change. Forceful diagnostics, standard reboot protocols, aggressive system overrides, those were for machines. For tools, this was something else. He'd need to be gentler, more respectful. He'd need to ask permission, not input commands. He watched the readouts again, seeing the story they now told. The armor was trying desperately to keep her functioning, but it was straining under the effort. Its responses were sluggish in some areas, frantic in others. It was like watching someone trying to hold up a collapsing wall with their bare hands. So the armor is you, David said, looking from the screen to her, and right now it's hurting. Yes. The simplicity of her answer was heavier than any technical report. The armor's current state was a biography of neglect, a chronicle of survival at any cost. Every patch, every field repair, every bypass was a paragraph in a story of endurance. But endurance has its limits. The armor was reaching hers. Its heroic effort to keep her alive was becoming the very thing that was draining her. A symbiotic relationship, slowly turning parasitic. The repair was no longer just about fixing broken parts. It was about healing a bond. David accessed the armor's diagnostic logs, and what he saw was less a maintenance record than a chronicle of attrition. Line after line of error codes, temporary overrides, and system patches stacked on the display like scars on old timber. The timeline stretched back years. He filtered for full system certifications, calibration clearances, neural alignment checks, the kind of thorough upkeep any complex machine requires to function safely. The last entry was timestamped 8 months prior. 8 months of combat, damage, and emergency fixes with no comprehensive review. He scrolled further. The pattern held. Brief moments of stability punctuated by long stretches of crisis management. He looked at Kiriel, her posture still rigid, her attention fixed on a point somewhere beyond the bay doors. You haven't had a full system diagnostic since the campaign on Xerxes 4, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact laid out in cold data. She didn't deny it. There was no time. No facility. The forward bases were mobile, often contested. Her voice was flat, the tone of someone stating the obvious. For her, this wasn't neglect. It was procedure. David leaned back, wiping a smear of grease from his wrist. So for 15 years, you've been running on field patches. Emergency bypasses, combat mode overrides. He gestured at the screen. This log shows over 40 separate instances of reactor shielding being manually reinforced with scrap alloys. You welded pieces of other ships onto your own power core. It held, she replied. The words were simple, final. The armor kept her alive. That was the only metric that mattered. But David was starting to see the other side of that equation. It held, he agreed. But at what cost? Every one of these patches, every override, it's a debt. The system compensates, but it draws that energy from somewhere. It's pulling power from life support to reinforce limb actuators. It's suppressing pain feedback to keep you conscious. It's keeping you on your feet by slowly burning out its own subsystems. He tapped the display, highlighting a cascading series of power reroutes from the last major engagement. This isn't maintenance. This is triage, permanent triage. For the first time, her stoicism showed a hairline fracture, a slight tightening around her eyes, a minute drop in her shoulders. She had always viewed the armor's adaptations as proof of its resilience of her own. Now David was reframing it. It wasn't resilience. It was sacrifice. The armor was giving up pieces of itself and pieces of her to maintain the illusion of function. "You've been treating it like a tool," he said, his voice lower now. "Something to be used until it breaks, then fixed just enough to be used again. But it's not a tool. It's a part of you. Every time you forced it past its limits, you were forcing yourself past yours. The fatigue, the neural feedback headaches, the slow degradation of motor control, that's not you failing. That's the armor's survival logic slowly eating you alive from the inside." He let the words hang in the air between them. The hum of the bay's environmental system sounded suddenly loud. Kirail's gaze dropped from the middle distance to her own hands, still encased in the gauntlets that had carried out every brutal, necessary fix. She flexed her fingers slowly, as if feeling the accumulated years of strain for the first time. This was the heart of it, a cultural script written in blood and battlefields. Improvisation over care, function over well-being, endurance celebrated above all else, even when that endurance became a form of slow self-destruction. The armor's heroic effort to keep her going had become the very mechanism of her decline. David watched her process it. The revelation wasn't just technical, it was personal. It challenged the foundation of her identity as a warrior. Her strength had always been measured by how much she could withstand. Now he was suggesting that true strength might lie in knowing when to stop. The resolution was clear in the grim set of her jaw. The data didn't lie. The armor's logic of survival had kept her in the fight, but it had been eroding her capacity to live. The question now was whether she could accept a different kind of strength. Kirill's voice held the flat certainty of drilled doctrine when she answered him. "Valoran maintenance protocols prioritize combat readiness above all. System stability is measured in battle effectiveness, not comfort. Dependence on external support is a tactical vulnerability." David listened, wiping a diagnostic probe clean on his thigh. He'd heard versions of this before. Not from aliens, but from mercenaries, military contractors, pilots who thought needing help was the same as admitting defeat. He understood the logic. In a firefight, you don't stop to recalibrate. You adapt. You overcome. But that logic had a shelf life. He'd seen it in the engine rooms of old warships, in the fractured bones of veterans who'd pushed too hard for too long. "I'm not talking about comfort," he said, setting the probe down. "I'm talking about performance. Right now, your armor is compensating for 15 years of damage by rerouting power from non-essential systems. But in a real fight, there are no non-essential systems. That energy, it's pulling from your nutrient dispensers and tissue regenerators. That's the energy you need to think clearly when someone's shooting at you. That neural delay you've learned to ignore? That's half a second between seeing a threat and reacting to it. Half a second is a long time when someone's aiming at your head." She didn't respond immediately. He watched her process the argument, the way her eyes narrowed just slightly. He was challenging a core belief, something deeper than technique or tradition. This was about identity. To her, accepting care felt like admitting weakness. To him, refusing it was the real weakness. "You see dependence as a failure," he continued, his tone even. "I see it as a partnership. A pilot depends on his ship's systems. A soldier depends on her squad. That's not a flaw. That's how things work. Your armor is your squad. It's your ship. And right now it's running on fumes because you've been treating it like a tool instead of a partner." He gestured toward the scanner display, where cascading error logs still glowed. "Look at the data, not the doctrine. The proof. Your current methods don't work long-term. They just delay the failure until it's catastrophic. Proper maintenance wouldn't make you weaker. It would make you faster, stronger, more responsive. You'd enter a fight at full capacity, not already depleted." For a moment, the bay was quiet except for the hum of environmental controls and the distant echo of the retreating storm. Kirail's stance shifted almost imperceptibly. The rigid line of her shoulders softened. Her gaze, which had been fixed on some middle distance, dropped to her own armored hands. She flexed her fingers slowly, as if feeling the accumulated strain for the first time. David didn't press. He let the silence hang. This wasn't just about repairing a machine. It was about redefining what strength meant. Was it the ability to endure endless damage or the wisdom to prevent it? Was it independence at all costs? or the strategic use of support to ensure lasting effectiveness. He saw the conflict play out on her face. The cultural script she'd lived by was clear. Self-reliance equals strength. Need equals vulnerability. But the evidence in front of her was undeniable. The armor's degraded state, the chronic fatigue she'd accepted as normal, the slow decline in performance she'd attributed to age or wear, it all pointed to a different truth. Care wasn't the opposite of strength. It was a multiplier. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. You suggest that allowing the armor to recover would enhance its function. My function? Yes, David said. Not just enhance, transform. You've been fighting with a hand tied behind your back for years and calling it strength. What if real strength is having both hands free? She didn't agree outright. That wasn't her way, but she gave a single slow nod. It was enough. The resolution was there, in the slight relaxation of her posture, the thoughtful tilt of her head. She was beginning to accept that care might be its own form of power, not a compromise but an advantage. The repair process was no longer a technical procedure. It was a test of this new perspective. Every adjustment, every calibration would now carry the weight of that possibility. Could gentleness make her stronger? Could attention to detail make her more lethal? The answers wouldn't come from manuals or doctrines. They would come from the work itself. David set aside the scanner and picked up a finer tool, its tip gleaming under the bay lights. He didn't move closer immediately. He just held it, letting her see it. The next part, he said, his voice low and even, requires accessing the primary neural port, at the base of your neck. It's going to feel strange, probably intimate, definitely vulnerable. He watched her face, the slight tightening around her eyes. The connections there are fragile. They handle most of your sensory input and motor coordination. I have to be careful, respectful. This isn't like patching a hull breach. Kirill didn't speak. Her posture, which had relaxed slightly during their conversation, went rigid again. This was different. The neck wasn't just another piece of armor. It was the junction, the place where machine and flesh met in the most direct way possible. David waited. He wasn't going to touch her without clear consent. Not here. The hum of the bay's ventilation system seemed to grow louder in the silence. She gave a single, sharp nod, not trusting him perhaps, but accepting the necessity. David moved in slowly. His first touch was feather light, just testing the security of the damaged plating near her shoulder. The armor felt warm through his gloves, almost alive with a low, resonant energy. He could feel the subtle vibration of overtaxed systems. The armor will be confused by my presence, he explained softly, his fingers tracing the seam he needed to open. It's only ever known your touch. This might feel intrusive. He found the release mechanism, a nearly invisible catch. With a soft click, a section of the shoulder plating retracted. What was revealed wasn't a mess of wires and circuits. It was an elegant complexity of organic-looking conduits and quantum processors, a network of light and energy that pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm. It was beautiful in a stark functional way. The bioneural interface, the literal mind of the armor. The micro-connection points along your spine are misaligned, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was speaking more to himself now, narrating the procedure to keep his own focus. Months without calibration. That's what's causing the feedback delays you've been feeling. He selected a microprobe from his kit. This might feel more intense. We're near major nerve clusters. He applied the probe. Kirill flinched. Not from pain. The readout showed no spike. It was a flinch of surprise, of unfamiliar sensation. Her body reacted to the careful, precise pressure, so different from the brutal yanks and shoves of field repairs. David's touch was reverent. He wasn't forcing anything. He was asking. The armor's response was immediate. On his secondary monitor, a cascade of stress indicators that had been glowing a persistent amber suddenly dipped toward green. The system wasn't fighting him, it was leaning into the contact. Kirill let out a breath she didn't seem to realize she'd been holding. The sensation was alien. For 15 years, every interaction with her armor had been a transaction of pure function. A quick weld to seal a breach, a hard reset to bypass a failing module. Pain was normal. Discomfort was standard. This careful, attentive manipulation was something else entirely. She felt the armor itself relax around her. The constant low-grade tension in the plates easing for the first time in years. It was like a muscle she hadn't known was clenched, finally unclenching. David worked in silence for a few minutes, his movements economical and exact. Each adjustment was tiny, a fraction of a millimeter, a subtle recalibration of energy flow. Precision work requires a light touch. He could feel the armor responding, adapting to his gentleness. It was a physical negotiation, yes, but also an emotional one. He was proving his earlier argument not with words, but with action. Care as a form of competence, gentleness as a form of strength. Then Kiriel spoke, her voice low and laced with a confusion that was entirely new. "You are touching me too softly." The statement hung in the air. It wasn't an accusation. It was a revelation, born from a lifetime of conditioning where touch was only ever utilitarian, often brutal. This careful, considered contact was so outside her experience that her only frame of reference was that it was wrong, too soft. It underscored the depth of her past, the sheer foreignness of being treated with something approaching care. David didn't stop working. He didn't look up. He just nodded as if she'd stated a simple fact. The repair had become something more than technical. It was a dialogue, a recalibration of trust happening in real time, mirrored by the silent, steady healing of the connection between warrior and armor. As the primary spinal link stabilized, flickering from red to a steady blue on his display, something shifted in the room. The air felt clearer. The hum of the armor was quieter, smoother. A deeper layer of truth, long buried under years of emergency protocols and battlefield compromises, was beginning to surface. David gained access to the armor's memory logs. The display filled with event markers, a relentless timeline of engagement stretching back over a decade and a half. Each entry was a small, brutal story of survival. He filtered for combat incidents and the list scrolled on, a grim catalog of damage and response. 47 separate instances of injury logged. 47 times the armor had intervened to keep her alive. The entries weren't just technical readouts. They were a biography written in system strain and emergency measures. The logs showed a clear pattern of compensation. When a servo in the right arm was shredded by shrapnel, the armor didn't just route power from a backup. It overclocked the entire left side actuator array to pick up the slack, a brute force solution that placed unsustainable stress on undamaged systems. A breach in the chest plate's cooling system led to the thermal regulators in the legs being forced to work at 150% capacity, a permanent emergency state that drained power from nutrient processing and tissue regeneration subroutines. The armor's brilliant adaptive design was being used as a crutch, forced to make up for catastrophic failures with desperate system-wide compromises. He scanned through the disabled functions. Subroutine after subroutine was listed as suppressed or ignored. The automatic injury recovery protocols designed to administer targeted pain blockers and stimulate cellular repair were off. The nutrition optimization systems, which should have been carefully managing her caloric and hydration intake during prolonged deployments, were set to a bare minimum emergency rationing mode. Most telling were the sleep cycle regulators. They were completely inactive. The armor was no longer helping her rest. It was helping her stay awake, chemically suppressing fatigue signals to keep her conscious and combat ready at all costs. Extended recovery was treated as a tactical liability, a luxury a warrior on the front lines couldn't afford. Kiriel had tolerated this degradation. She had accepted the chronic headaches, the deep muscle fatigue, the slower reaction times as the inevitable cost of doing business. The logs confirmed it. Her only inputs were commands to override safety limits, to prioritize immediate mobility over long-term function. She had lived for 15 years in a state of permanent managed decline, believing that pushing through the pain was the definition of strength. The armor had mirrored her choices perfectly. It sacrificed its own integrity, its own designed purpose of holistic support, to fulfill her immediate need to stay in the fight. The consequences were written in the data. The constant overclocking of secondary systems generated a low-grade energy drain that never ceased. This parasitic draw manifested for the wearer as a persistent, grinding fatigue that no amount of rest could fully alleviate. The suppressed pain feedback led to chronic low-level inflammation. The ignored neural recalibration requests resulted in the micro-delays David had observed, a half-second lag between thought and action that could mean the difference between life and death. The armor was keeping her breathing, keeping her moving, but it was also slowly eroding her from the inside out. It was a life of function, but not of well-being. David didn't need to summarize it for her. The evidence was all there on the screen, a stark testament to a philosophy of endless endurance. "It kept you alive," he said, his voice flat. He pointed to a log entry from 6 months prior, a glancing plasma burn that should have required days of recovery. The armor had stabilized the wound, then immediately rerouted all regenerative energy back to mobility systems. But look at the cost. For every injury it patched, it created 2 new points of strain. It was solving today's problem by creating next year's crisis. The realization was existential. The armor's sacrifices were a perfect mirror of her own. It had given up its health for her survival, just as she had given up her well-being for her duty. The bond was so complete that their declines were intertwined. The armor wasn't a separate entity failing her. It was an extension of her own will, her own cultural programming slowly burning itself out to meet impossible expectations. It was a cycle of mutual depletion. The logs provided final, irrefutable proof. Emergency mode wasn't a temporary state for this armor. It was the only state it had known for years. It had been running on a war footing for so long that it had forgotten how to simply exist. Every system was taxed. Every resource was depleted. The constant strain wasn't just draining power. It was draining her. David leaned back from the console, the grim history glowing between them. The question was no longer about fixing what was broken. It was about something more fundamental. What would this armor, what would Kirill look like when they were finally allowed to stop surviving and start healing? The answer wasn't in the logs. It was in the work still left to do. David paused, setting down a microcalibrator. The gentle hum of the bay seemed to amplify the silence between them. He didn't look at the screen full of diagnostics. He looked at Kirill. Her posture was still that of a soldier, but the rigidity had given way to a quiet, watchful fatigue. He kept his voice low, conversational, a stark contrast to the technical jargon that had filled the air for hours. It was a question that had been forming since he first saw the brutal patchwork of her armor, the history of neglect written in its scarred surface. "Has anyone ever treated your equipment with gentleness?" The question hung there, simple and unadorned. It wasn't about tools or techniques. It wasn't about Valerian engineering or human methodology. It was a question about worth, about how she and the part of her that was the armor had been regarded for 15 years. It asked whether anyone had ever considered her comfort, her well-being as a factor worth considering. Kirill didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was fixed on a scorch mark on the far wall. The stoic mask she wore was a well-practiced one, but it had been under sustained assault. The data logs had shown the cost of her endurance. David's careful touch had introduced a sensation so foreign it was almost alarming. Now this question, direct and personal, found the final crack in her composure. "Care is considered a form of weakness in Valerian culture," she said, her voice flat, reciting a lesson learned in Blood and Fire. "Dependence is a failure of self-sufficiency. A warrior must be independent completely." The words were rote, a creed implanted so deeply it was almost a part of her biology. But the delivery lacked its usual conviction. It sounded hollow, a recording played back in an empty room. The admission cost her. He could see it in the slight tremor of her lower lip, the way her eyes closed for a fraction of a second too long. For her entire adult life, this belief had been the foundation of her identity. To voice it aloud now in this context was to hear its flaws. The confession didn't just crack her stoicism. It shattered the illusion of its necessity. She had built a fortress of self-reliance, and David's simple question had just shown her the door. On the monitor beside them, the armor's vital signs responded instantly, a cascade of stress indicators which had flickered for hours in the amber and red zones, abruptly dropped. Systems that had been locked in a permanent state of high alert began to relax. The readout slid into the green, not in a hesitant stumble but in a smooth, decisive wave. It was a physiological sigh of relief, a release of tension so profound it was almost palpable in the air. The armor, an extension of her very being, was responding to the mere suggestion of a different paradigm. It was embracing the idea of care before the care had even been fully given. David watched the data flow, then turned his attention back to her. "It's not a failure to need maintenance," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "It's biology. It's physics. Everything wears. Everything needs care. You deserve that care, not because it makes you a better weapon for someone else, but because it lets you be you." He was reframing the entire ethics of the situation, moving the goalposts from pure utility to inherent value. Her worth wasn't conditional on her combat readiness. She deserved care for her own sake. The repair process shifted in that moment. It was no longer a technical procedure aimed at restoring function. The soldering iron, the neural probes, the recalibration software, they became instruments of healing. Each careful adjustment was an argument against a culture of brutal utility. Every gentle touch was a rebuttal to the notion that suffering was strength. He wasn't just fixing broken circuits. He was mending a broken contract between a warrior and her own well-being. Kiriel listened. The rigid set of her jaw softened. She watched his hands work, not with the suspicion of a soldier assessing a threat, but with the quiet focus of someone witnessing a new idea take shape. The resolution was quiet, internal. She didn't announce a change of heart, but a deep-seated belief, one that had guided her for a decade and a half, had been successfully challenged. The possibility that gentleness might be its own form of strength, a sophisticated and potent one, was now lodged in her mind. It was a seed, small but tenacious. As he resumed the delicate work on the spinal connection, the atmosphere in the bay felt different, lighter. The air hummed with a new kind of potential. The recalibration was proceeding, but it felt less like a repair and more like an awakening. The armor's systems were no longer just responding to commands. They were beginning to harmonize, to integrate with a new, quieter rhythm. A rhythm that included, for the first time, the possibility of peace. Kiriel's first words after the final calibration were quiet, spoken to the air more than to him. "Different," she said. Then a moment later, as if surprised by the sensation, she added, "It feels like it did when it was new." The statement carried a weight that went beyond technical assessment. It was a confession, a memory of a state of being she hadn't realized was lost. David watched the readouts. The neural delays that had plagued her movements for months were gone. The interfaces responded instantly, not with the laggy hesitation of overtaxed systems, but with a clean, fluid precision. The armor's internal status shifted from a frantic mosaic of warnings to a coherent, stable flow of data. It wasn't just functioning. It was integrating. The bioneural matrix was no longer fighting itself. The stress indicators had dropped to their lowest levels since the diagnostic began, a quiet hum of green where there had only been angry red and amber. This wasn't a machine rebooted. It was something coming back to life. The armor moved with her now, not as a separate shell she commanded, but as a true extension of her will. The sensation was so alien it took her a moment to recognize it. For years, wearing the armor had been an act of constant negotiation, a subtle struggle against its limitations and its pain. Now, it felt like a partnership. The plates shifted with her breathing. The servos responded to the slightest muscle twitch. It was part of her, in a way it hadn't been since the initial bonding. The difference was profound. It was the difference between driving a battered vehicle and simply deciding to move. His careful touch had yielded tangible results. The joint that had grated for months now moved smoothly, a silent, fluid motion that felt almost effortless. The armor's biomechanical matrix showed clear signs of relief, the energy patterns evening out from jagged peaks to a calm, steady rhythm. It was like watching someone who'd been holding their breath for years finally exhale. The systems were no longer in a desperate scramble to compensate for damage. They were optimizing for health, for longevity. The shift was visible on the screens and palpable in the air. The low, stressed hum of the armor had been replaced by a quieter, more resonant tone. This was more than a fix. It was a rebirth. The bond between warrior and armor, strained to the breaking point by years of brutal necessity, was healing. The connection was no longer just a data link. It was a shared state of being. The armor's well-being was directly shaping hers, and for the first time in over a decade, that well-being was being prioritized. The constant background fatigue she'd accepted as normal was receding, replaced by a clarity she'd forgotten was possible. Kiriel's sense of wonder grew with each passing second. She flexed her fingers, rotated her shoulders, shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Each movement was a revelation. The stiffness was gone. The slight resistance in the left hip actuator had vanished. She hadn't just gotten used to the degradation. She had built her entire combat style around compensating for it. She'd accepted the delays, the aches, the chronic drain as the price of being a warrior. Now, feeling the armor respond with the grace and speed it was designed for, She understood the true extent of what she'd lost. She hadn't been operating at a disadvantage. She'd been fighting with a critical system failure that never ended. The resolution was clear in the silent, focused way she examined her own gauntleted hand. The armor was alive. Its health was not a separate concern from her own. They were inextricably linked. Its recovery was her recovery. Its potential was her potential. The philosophy of endurance at all costs, which had defined her life, was being quietly dismantled by the simple, undeniable evidence of feeling better, stronger, more whole. She looked at David, not with gratitude, but with a kind of dazed reassessment. He had not given her back her armor. He had given her back a part of herself she thought was gone for good. The work was done. The systems were stable. The emergency was over. The next morning she would test this new reality. Not in theory, not on a screen, but in motion. In the combat sequences she had run 1,000 times before. Every movement a testament to what was possible when a machine and its wearer are truly, fully alive. The next morning, Kirill walked to the open space at the center of the repair bay. There was no announcement, no preamble. She simply began to move, and the armor moved with her. It wasn't the stiff, powerful lunge of a soldier in heavy gear. It was something else entirely. The plates shifted and flowed over her muscles like liquid mercury, a seamless extension of her will with no resistance, no drag, no catch. She flowed through a standard Valorant combat sequence, but it was no longer standard. The movements were smoother, more responsive than she had ever experienced. Each pivot was precise. Each strike landed with clean, efficient force. There was no wasted motion, no compensating for weak systems or delayed responses. The armor wasn't just keeping up. It was matching her intent perfectly. Every system was operating at its designed specifications for the first time since the initial bonding. The feeling was so foreign it was almost disorienting. For 15 years she had known the armor as a heavy, reliable but ultimately limited shell. Now it felt weightless. The strength enhancers responded with a gentle, powerful hum that amplified her movements instead of the labored grind she was used to. The sensory filters provided crystal-clear environmental data without the static haze of overtaxed processors. It was the difference between hearing a symphony through a wall and sitting in the front row. The armor anticipated her intent with a grace and efficiency that felt less like technology and more like instinct. It read the micro-tensions in her muscles, the shift in her balance, the focus of her gaze, and responded not with a command delay but with instantaneous, fluid support. David watched from his workstation, a cup of cooling coffee forgotten in his hand. He didn't need the readouts to see the change. It was written in her posture, in the clean lines of her movement. "It's functioning as designed," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet whir of servos. Finally, not in emergency mode, not in survival configuration, just working. He'd seen plenty of gear perform well. This was different. This was a system finally allowed to achieve its full potential, and in doing so, unlocking the full potential of its user. The performance didn't just recover to some past baseline she remembered. It exceeded anything she thought was possible. The armor's reactivated systems, the ones for recovery, for nutrient optimization, for neural recalibration, were working in concert. They weren't just fixing damage. They were enhancing function. Her reactions were faster. Her stamina felt limitless. The chronic, low-grade pain that had been her constant companion was simply gone. The emotional payoff of that moment was profound, and it showed on her face. The focused grimace of a soldier running a drill softened into an expression of pure, unadulterated wonder. For a moment she stopped. She looked at her own hands, turning them over slowly, watching the way the light played over the perfectly aligned plates. She wasn't just a contract warrior performing a function. She was a person experiencing a capability she never knew she had. The care and technical sophistication David had applied hadn't just enhanced her combat readiness. It had enhanced her life. The armor was no longer a tool for a job. It was a part of her that allowed her to be more herself. The clarity of thought, the absence of pain, the effortless power, it all pointed to a simple, revolutionary truth. She was more than her function. This was the resolution, reached not through debate but through undeniable physical experience. She was a person whose potential had been locked behind 15 years of neglect and a cultural doctrine that mistook suffering for strength. Proper maintenance hadn't been a luxury or a sign of weakness. It was the key. The armor, functioning optimally, didn't make her a better weapon for someone else's war. It made her a more complete version of herself. She finished the sequence and came to a rest, her breathing even and calm. The armor settled around her with a quiet, resonant hum, a sound of peace instead of strain. She stood there in the center of the bay, not as a warrior waiting for her next mission, but as a person rediscovering what her body and her life could actually feel like. The outside world, however, had a long memory and a short patience for personal rediscovery. The quiet was shattered by the sharp, insistent chime of a priority message alert flashing across David's main console. The Stormwind Company's insignia filled the screen. The automated header scrolled, "Mission status update required. High-stakes engagement. Casualty estimates attached." The tranquility of the moment evaporated. The armor's smooth hum immediately shifted in pitch, the plates subtly retensioning, systems automatically priming for combat configuration. Old habits forged in fire over 15 years were not so easily unlearned. The transition was jarring. The peace of the bay was gone, replaced by the cold reality of obligation. Her next move would not be another fluid combat exercise. It would be a choice. The silence of the bay was ripped apart by the sharp, repeating chime of a priority transmission. It wasn't the standard colony network. This signal pulsed on an encrypted military band, its frequency sharp and intrusive, cutting through the calm David's workshop usually held. The Stormwind Company's insignia flashed on his main console, a stark geometric design he recognized from enough wreckage reports. The message header scrolled automatically. "Mission status update required. High-stakes engagement. Casualty estimates attached." The words were dry, bureaucratic, but the subtext was a demand. A recall notice. Across the bay, Kiriel's body went rigid. The fluid grace of moments before evaporated. Her armor responded to the signal with a deep, resonant thrum, plates shifting and locking into an active combat configuration. The helmet, which had remained retracted, slid forward with a soft hydraulic hiss sealing over her head. The visor glowed a faint, menacing amber. It was an instantaneous conditioned reflex. 15 years of training and battlefield protocol took over in a heartbeat. The peace of the morning was gone, replaced by the cold readiness for violence. Her voice, when it came, was filtered through the helmet's vocal modulator, flat and devoid of the nuance it had held just minutes before. It was her default identity, the only one the company had ever wanted or needed. "This is Kiriel," she stated, the words a rote transmission. "I experienced equipment failure during the ion storm. Repairs are nearly complete. I returned to combat." The statement was a shield, an automatic return to the known, the expected, the path of least resistance paved with duty and the grim acceptance of perpetual war. But the path wasn't the same. That was the crucial difference. She stood there, a warrior primed for battle, but for the first time in over a decade she wasn't in pain. She wasn't fighting through a grinding fatigue or ignoring the lag in her neural feed. Her armor felt like a part of her, not a burden she carried. It was optimally functioning equipment, and that optimal function gave her something she hadn't possessed before. A real choice. The physical clarity forced a moment of mental clarity. The automatic response felt automatic, hollow. David watched the transformation from his console. He saw the armor lock down, saw her become the soldier again. He'd seen that look before on the faces of vets who'd been out for years but still jumped at loud noises. Old habits worn deep into the psyche. He didn't try to argue with the soldier. He spoke to the person behind the helmet. "They'll just send you into the next fight," he said, his voice calm, cutting through the tension. "And the next one. That's the job. But you could stay. The repairs are done, but the maintenance, that's a skill. You could learn it. You could do something else." He was offering an alternative narrative. Not a life of taking orders, but one of understanding how things work. A life of fixing instead of breaking. Kiriel didn't move. The internal conflict was a silent war behind the amber visor. She weighed the immediate obligations. The Stormwind Company expected reporting, expected compliance. Defiance meant a breach of contract. It meant burning a bridge with the only employer she'd known for 15 years. It meant a reputation as unreliable, a liability. The consequences were tangible, a list of professional repercussions she could easily quantify. But she weighed it against the feeling in her body. The newfound fluidity, the absence of the constant draining pain, the quiet hum of systems finally at peace instead of perpetually straining. David's offer was a chance for something new, something undefined, a life where her value wasn't measured solely in enemies eliminated or missions completed. A life where care wasn't a sign of failure but a daily practice. The tension between these two futures was a physical pressure in the room. Obligation with its clear, brutal rules versus autonomy, with its terrifying and exhilarating uncertainty. The resolution wasn't a shouted declaration. It was a quiet settling. She had to decide. Right now. The message on the screen was a door closing. David's offer was a door opening. Both led into the unknown, but only one offered a chance to be more than a weapon. The choice was hers alone. Her next move, a simple reply to a corporate message, would define everything that came after. It would be the most important command she'd ever given. Kirael chose to reject the immediate mission. The decision didn't come with a grand speech or a dramatic gesture. It was quieter than that, more final. She stood there for a long moment, the Stormwind Company's demand still glowing on the screen, her armor still humming in its defensive crouch. Then with a deliberate slowness, she reached up and disengaged her helmet. It retracted with a soft hiss, revealing her face. The combat-ready tension dissolved from her features, replaced by a calm, weary resolve. She was done taking their orders. She composed the message with a focused precision, her fingers moving over the console's interface. The words were a model of official brevity. Informing the Stormwind Company that my equipment suffered critical failures during the ion storm, she dictated, her voice level. Systems compromised beyond field repair capabilities. Recovery time indefinite. Mission readiness suspended until further notice. She sent it without hesitation. The transmission light blinked once, then went dark. The demand on the screen was replaced by a simple confirmation of receipt. The tension in the bay was a live wire. The statement was a lie, a complete fabrication. Her armor was in better condition now than it had been in a decade. But the lie was strategic. It was necessary. It bought her the one thing she had never been granted in 15 years of service: time. And with that time came space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space to exist without the immediate crushing pressure of the next engagement, the next casualty report, the next demand to be a weapon. This wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a withdrawal from a war she was no longer sure she believed in. It was a concrete signal of her willingness to reconsider everything. 15 years of constant combat had worn a groove in her mind, a single track leading from one fight to the next. Stepping off that track felt less like a decision and more like a physical act, like jumping from a moving transport. The lie was the first real choice she'd made for herself that wasn't about survival. It was about something else entirely. David watched her from his workbench, a half-disassembled power relay in his hands. He didn't comment on the lie. He didn't congratulate her. He just gave a short, dry laugh and shook his head. "Just so you know," he said, gesturing vaguely around the bay with a screwdriver, "the coffee here is terrible, and the pay is strictly mediocre." It was an offer not of glory or excitement, but of mundane reality. It was improvisational humor, a way to ground a moment that felt impossibly large. He was lightening the moment by underscoring the sheer ordinary nature of the alternative. It wasn't about becoming a hero in a new way. It was about maybe learning a trade, drinking bad coffee, earning a living that didn't involve watching people die. The choice was a signal, clear and unmistakable. It was a readiness to explore an alternative life. Not as a retired warrior, but as a different kind of person entirely. Someone who fixed things instead of broke them. Someone who understood systems from the inside out. The path was undefined, unclear, and that was the point. For the first time, the future wasn't a predetermined set of coordinates. It was a question. Her posture as she turned from the console said everything. The rigid stance of the soldier was gone. She didn't stand at attention. She just stood. Her hands hung loosely at her sides. Her gaze was calm, thoughtful, looking at the tools on the walls, the spare parts in their bins, the quiet hum of the bay itself. There was no hesitation in her, no second-guessing. Her calm, deliberate posture showed a commitment to this new path. It wasn't a gamble. It was a conclusion she had reached. The resolution was absolute. She had opted for care over combat. She had chosen the difficult, uncertain work of maintaining something, of maintaining herself. over the familiar brutality of destroying things for a paycheck. She had chosen autonomy, the right to make her own choices for her own reasons over obligation, the endless chain of duties owed to a corporation that saw her as an asset. The lie was the key that unlocked the door. She had walked through it. The story ends not with a conclusion but with an opening. The heavy defined shape of her old life was gone, replaced by the open, undefined space of possibility. The future was a blank slate. It could be anything. A chance to learn, a chance to heal, a chance to be someone new. The armor around her hummed, not with the strain of combat readiness, but with the quiet, steady rhythm of a system finally at peace. It was waiting too, ready for whatever came next, ready to be redefined. Kirail's journey ends not with a battle cry, but with a quiet recalibration of strength. Her acceptance of care over combat reveals that power isn't just grit, it's maintenance. It's the choice to treat yourself like something built to last. The armor's transformation mirrors her own. Both needed gentleness to exceed their limits. Choosing empathy over endurance isn't weakness. It's the most radical act of all. It redefines what it means to be powerful, not by how much you can destroy, but by how well you can preserve. Starting with yourself.